available to college graduates. Many college graduates are what we might call underemployed, taking jobs as baristas or working in fast food places or discount stores. Fourth, there are too many restrictions at too many schools on free expression, ability of people to express their ideas without fear of intimidation from others. Maybe I should say a little bit more about some of those points are fairly self-explanatory, but let me say a little bit more about a couple of them, and then I will add a few other things and before we go into some sort of discussion and interaction between me and you in the audience. As far as too costly goes, if you go back about a generation or so, let's say go back to about 1970. In 1970, the average tuition at American universities absorbed about 8% of the family income for a year of a typical family. Actually, it's household income of a typical household, 8%. By 2010, 2012, that figure had risen to 22%. The tuition at American colleges has not only risen, but it's risen faster than people's incomes. So therein lies a big problem. If that number continues to grow, at some point college becomes financially unsustainable for many Americans, and it becomes unsustainable for the nation as well. So that's a problem. And the question is, why does this problem exist? And in a sense, some would argue that colleges have always had this problem. It's a labor-intensive industry. We teach pretty much the same way, many of us do, as Socrates did 2,400 years ago. And it's inherently expensive, very difficult to get productivity advance in a labor-intensive service industry like this. Some would argue that. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But the rate of inflation, tuition price inflation, has about tripled since the mid to late 1970s. And the reason, I think, is largely related to federal student financial aid programs, which have turned out to be sort of an open invitation for universities to raise their fees. The universities say, hey, we can raise our fees. The kids will find some way to pay for it because the federal government will lend them the money. And rather than the students benefiting from those programs, in many cases it's been members of the university community. That has led to high tuition fees. It's led to universities having bloated administrations. It has led to excessive spending in many areas of universities, including extravagant recreational facilities, low teaching loads for faculty, and so on. So these are some of the problems that we face. As far as learning goes on, here's a little factoid for you. In 1960, roughly, the average grade point average of an American university student was about 2.5, and the average student spent about 40 hours a week in classroom or studying or otherwise doing academic things, 40 hours a week. Today, the average grade point average is about 3.1. The number of hours spent on academic things on average has fallen dramatically to about 27 hours a week. So kids are doing less or more, and they almost certainly are learning less since they're spending less time working on academic affairs. There's surprisingly little information about how much kids actually learn in college, but what little there is suggests that at the best, learning is stagnant and more likely that shown actual declines in some areas. With regards to the jobs picture, things have changed in that we have credential inflation and higher Ed, and now, because there are so many graduates with college degrees, employers are now imposing college degree requirements for all kinds of jobs where they previously didn't have them.
You're asking questions up there. I want to see your face more if you can look at the camera.
So, so this is a problem. We have, for example, in 1970, 1 out of every 150 taxi drivers was a college graduate. Today, out of every 150 taxi drivers, at least 25 are graduates. So we had a 25-fold increase in that. So these are a few things that are going on. Let me just say a few more things, and then we'll go into some questions. Let me just mention 3 other sort of little scandals in higher ed that we just don't have time to get into, but at least let me mention what they are. Intercollegiate athletics is a scandal. It's too costly at many schools. The universities are being subsidizing sports, sometimes costing $1,000 or more per student. It's too exploitive of the athletes in many cases. It's too corrupt. There's all sorts of corruption going on, shoe contracts and so forth, sexual misconduct and so on. So it is turning out to be a real problem for society. As I mentioned, we have underutilized resources in universities. The faculty teach too little. I teach, if I were teaching full-time now, a third less than I did when I started teaching. Same university, same kinds of students, 1/3 less teaching. That's very typical. Students, I mentioned, are studying too little. Buildings are underutilized. They lie empty months of the year. These are very expensive buildings because we're now putting atriums in ordinary classrooms and all sorts of things like this. So, and one last problem is the governance of universities is murky. Everyone thinks they own the university. The faculty think they own the university. The students think they own the university. The trustees really own the university in most cases, but they are usually relatively clueless as to what's going on because the administration doesn't want them to know about things that are difficult or embarrassing. So we have a lot of problems in American higher ed. The solution to all of this, 3 key words. Let's start with the letter I. One word is information. Another word is incentives. And the third word is innovation. If we provide if we have more information on what's going on in universities, we can get better outcomes. If we incentivize professors and staff and students and everyone to perform better, we can get better academic outcomes at probably a lower price. If we use innovations and technology more intelligently, we can also lower costs. So these are some of the issues that we're facing. I think the single biggest problem, if I had to pick one problem that is causing the most problem, relates to government financing. It's relating to student loan programs, and et cetera. But there are others as well. So that sort of gives you an overview of what is going on right now. Now, I've only talked for 12 or 13 or 14 minutes. I can elaborate a little bit more on this. I think, as I say, the single biggest problem is the federal student loan programs and aid programs have allowed universities to raise their prices a lot. And the universities have done so. And then the question is, well, what do they do with the money they get from the higher tuition fees that they're collecting? Well, we have lower teaching loads than we did 25 years ago. We have higher salaries than we did on average 25 years ago. So the faculty are doing pretty well. The administration has exploded at most universities. The number of administrators, correcting for even the students' enrollments, have roughly doubled since the mid-1970s. There's about twice as many administrators around for any given number of students as there were 40 years ago. So we have a massive university bureaucracies built up, which, in my humble opinion, has not improved universities generally. Indeed, it's made them less efficient and less good in many ways. Some universities impose technology fees, so when they want to put in new computer labs and all, they charge the students to pay for them. If General Motors did that, or if Apple Computer tried to do that, they say, well, we're putting some new machinery in to make our products more cheaply. Everyone thinks, and so we got to raise our prices in order to pay for these machines. Everyone would say they're crazy. So there are a lot of problems in higher ed today that are, as a consequence, I think at least in part, of a more intrusive governmental role than is probably optimal. In the private sector, we have what Joseph Schumpeter once called creative destruction. Every now and then, businesses are fail. And when businesses fail, there's some people lose their jobs. There are some people lose a lot of income and wealth. But it also is a signal to society. Society is, in effect, through the market, sending a signal that we need to reallocate our resources in a more efficient way, and other businesses grow to replace those. That doesn't happen in higher ed. The top 10 schools in the U.S. News and World Report rankings in 1994 haven't changed a bit, much, either in terms of their rankings, there's some minor changes, or in terms of their organization. If we took the Fortune 500 from 1994 and we took the top 10 companies like General Motors, 7 out of those top 10 have fundamentally changed. Names have changed. They've been merged. One of them has gone bankrupt and been resurrected, but it went through bankruptcy. Big changes. So we don't have the impetus in the non-market, non-profit higher ed sector to do the kinds of things that need to be done. Well, I've talked now for over 20, for almost 20 minutes, and maybe the time has come for me to start asking, answering some questions. For example, Ariana Richardson asked me a question: what is your position on for-profit colleges and the problems they typically have? How should they be fixed? That's a good question. The for-profit industry in higher ed, if you go back to, say, the year 2000, was about 1% of all students were at for-profit schools, pretty small. But then it got up to about 10% 8 or 9 years later, and now it has fallen again because that sector has undergone a lot of regulatory scrutiny and attacks, some would say, particularly during the Obama years. That's an industry that I think has a lot of promise. I think it can be useful. I have visited for-profit schools and so forth. There are some incentives at for-profit schools that do tend to promote efficiency, tend to promote, believe it or not, interest in students and student learning outcomes, because if you don't have good student learning outcomes, ultimately you don't have students. So there's some aspects of the for-profit model that I think are very good and whatnot. There have been bad actors in that field. There have been people that have run fly-by-night outfits just in order to grab federal student loan money that the students are able to get, and then the colleges grab it from them in the form of tuition fees. And so although it's considered a private industry, it's very dependent on federal funds. If we fix the federal student loan program, makes federal student loans a little bit more along a sort of a commercial model, a model that would be followed, say, in the banking sector, we probably would have some cut down in that for-profit industry. But I have seen some good ones. Purdue University just bought one of the big for-profit outfits, Kaplan University, or it's in the process of trying to buy it. And I consider that a very interesting and maybe promising model, a good experiment at least, to let a public university that's not for profit take over a company that has had a lot of experience running online education programs and see what they do with it. Liam Reeves asked me, what is my opinion on accreditation? I think accreditation is a scandal in America. First of all, the first problem with accreditation is the people who do the accreditation have a monumental conflict of interest. The boards of the accrediting organizations are controlled by universities that are, in fact, accredited by those accrediting organizations. They have conflicts of interest. There's a fundamental problem that accreditation is it's almost like pregnancy. You either are accredited or you're not accredited. There's no attempt to provide quality variations in rankings. The accreditation reports are usually made privately to the universities, not publicly to the broader community of university communities, which I think is questionable. There's just a whole variety of problems with accreditation. Accreditation restricts entry into higher ed. It makes it harder to start new universities. The old universities controlling the accreditation organizations are skeptical of new models, new approaches to learning, and thus I think it tends to stifle innovation. I could go on and on and on. So I would like to just totally abolish accreditation as some sort of requirement, but we do have to, as long as we have some federal financial aid programs, we do have to have some way of starting those, or not allowing those colleges that are truly fraudulent to operate. So we need something, but I think we need to move away from the system accreditation as it is. I was asked, what do you think is less harmful, federal grants or federal loans? That's asking me a question like, who is worse, Stalin or Hitler? And that's a little unfair, I suspect. I actually, the idea of federal grants is not a bad idea conceptually and could be administered in a rather good way, sort of like a voucher where we give qualified students who have reasonable academic promise and financial need. We could give them vouchers and let them go wherever they want to school. It could be done in a way that would foster greater competition, give students a greater sort of empower them more in the process of dealing with universities and so forth. The loan programs are just dysfunctional. The main problem with the whole federal system is there are too many programs. There are more than 15 different programs, and we have programs on top of programs. And we have Perkins loans, and we have Stafford loans, and we have subsidized and unsubsidized loans. We have federal work study. We have federal tuition tax credits. Do we need all those? Why don't we just go to one loan program and one grant program and try to phase out the loan programs? Why don't we try to privatize them by moving towards something like income share agreements, where private companies provide funds for kids to go to college, but then take a share of the income of the student for a given number of years afterwards, and so that the burden of financing the student falls on the investor. They're taking the risk much more than the student, and which I think is good. and it can be done in a way that I think could get the federal government out of the student loan business or reduce of it. Lily asked me a question about safe speech zones on a campus. And what do you think of those who are punished for speaking controversial opinions outside of the said speech zones? Well, I just think speech zones are a horrible idea. Now, I will admit that there are some places on campus where there should be not an opportunity for anyone to walk in a room and just say what they want. When I'm teaching a class, and by the way, I was teaching a class a couple hours ago in American economic history, if some student had walked into my classroom and started expounding on whatever the topic of the moment is or whatever they're interested in, I think that's inappropriate because they're disrupting other speakers. But I think as a general rule that on campuses that people should be able to speak pretty much anywhere they want at any time on any topic as long as they're not disrupting the ordinary business of the university, the other business of the university. Generally speaking, that means they should be allowed to speak almost anywhere outside. Inside buildings are a little more problematic because inside building there's activities going on that where large gatherings of people could be highly disruptive and prevent the university from doing business that it needs to do. So that's a generalization. I think one of the great affronts, one of the great problems of the modern era is that we have lost sight of the fact that discourse between people that goes on in a sort of a somewhat civilized fashion, or not to be rather heated fashion, but at least in a nonviolent fashion, is that this sort of discourse between people, this sort of argument and discussion, even of harebrained, crazy ideas, is part of what makes universities interesting, part of what leads to new ideas that are good ideas from developing. Is part of what a university is about, the exploration of different ways of doing things. And I think safe speech zones is sort of an oxymoron. The notion that we need somehow to protect students because of their delicate psyches, they can't take speech which might be somehow offensive to them, is an idea that bothers me. I think students should be somewhat offended by some of the things they hear on campus. They should disagree with them. They should, but that should get them to think. It should get them to think of why that they are offended and talk back. Someone asked a question about, we got $23 billion in debt right now, and the question has passed by, and I can't see the rest of it, but I think in general the question was something to the effect, in effect, why are we subsidizing universities so much in this day, and can we afford to do so with all this federal debt that we have run up? And should the government give out money that we don't have since we're $23 trillion in debt? It's a good question. What's happening now is the federal student loan programs are being financed by the federal government. So what the federal government is doing to some extent, and last year we ran a government deficit of $668 billion, I believe that's true, about two-thirds of $1 trillion last just for 1 year. It's almost $2 billion a day in debt. And so what the government does is it goes out and borrows money, and then from, say, the Chinese investors, and lends it to American students. This is an unsustainable model in the long run, I think. And it is true, the ratio of debt to output or capacity to pay in the United States is extremely high for a period that's relatively peaceful. We're not in major wars now, and a period where we've had 8-9 years of expansion. The last recession ostensibly ended in mid-2009, so we're in our 9th year of expansion. it's almost unprecedented for us to be running a deficit equal to 3.4% of GDP, which is what we're doing. So I think we are acting fiscally irresponsibly right now, and it is contributing to some of the problems in universities. So that's, to me, another reason why we probably should be dialing down some of these programs in my judgment. Someone asked, would it help to make colleges less expensive if we vary prices for each major? What are problems with this idea? I think in general it's a pretty good idea to consider varying prices in the university. First of all, it's obvious that the cost of educating students varies from discipline to discipline within universities. There's no question about that. I think you can justify on some sort of cost-benefit grounds charging students more in some areas than in others. And so, on the whole, I think it's a good idea. There are some practical problems with it. What if you change majors? You go from one tuition level to another. Students at any one time, they may be majoring in one subject or taking half of their work, maybe general education requirements in a broader liberal arts context, and you vary tuition by courses. Actually, Adam Smith, 241 years ago in The Wealth of Nations, had an interesting idea. He said, why don't each professor charge tuition for their own classes and then maybe kick some of that money back to the university to help pay overhead, and let the professors get paid depending on how many students they can bring in. And I suppose in that model, professors could decide the fees and decide, professors will try to maximize their own income. They might try to charge a high fee, but if they charge too high, students will take another professor who will be cheaper. Do I want the low-priced professor or the high-priced professor? No one is talking about doing that. Smith claims that when that happened back in before 1776, before The Wealth of Nations was written, colleges ran much better than when they went to the model where the university charged a fee to everyone, a blanket fee to everyone. He said the quality of instruction went down. The professors got paid no more if they did a good job of teaching as opposed to a bad job. Maybe we should move towards that kind of model. What can we, Sarah asked, what can we do to lower the cost of tuition? Well, I think if we reduce the demand for higher education that is being sort of artificially created by some of these student financial aid programs, I think in time that would lead to certainly a stop in the tuition inflation and maybe some rollback in fees. It's interesting, enrollments have fallen for the last 6 years in higher ed. And the reason seems to be kids are starting to say, hey, the benefits of going to college are not rising, but maybe getting a little smaller. You hear about all these kids ending up working at Starbucks when they graduate, which you could do with a high school diploma. The benefits are stagnant. The costs are rising, so some people are saying just say no to college. And so a few colleges now are actually starting to cut tuition fees for next year, believe it or not. And some fairly prominent schools are talking about 20-30% reduction in fees and do less discounting of tuition to charge different amounts to different students. I think it's an idea that time has come. Olivia asked me, do you think teacher tenure is an important issue in higher ed? And I think tenure is an issue, but how important of an issue is debatable. I think as a whole it tends to get a little bit overstated as a problem because there are benefits to tenure, there are costs to tenure. At a typical university, about 1/3 to 40% of the budget goes for instruction directly and involves spending on tenured professors. 60 or 70% of the money goes for other things. So I would appreciate. This is an issue. If I had my druthers, I think I would offer professors when they're hired a choice. Do you want to be on a tenure track or do you want to be on a non-tenure track? Most would say, of course I want tenure. Well, then you tell them, well, that's a fringe benefit you're buying. You're buying job security, and so you're going to take a $10,000 smaller salary or $15,000 smaller salary. In other words, we ought to recognize that tenure confers benefits on professors, and we should make that make that more explicit in the cost structure of the universities. To me, it isn't a top issue, one of the top 3 or 4. What should government do about the hazing issue favoring higher education, Kelly asked. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by that. I assume this is referring to issues such as fraternities like the recent Phi Delta Theta episode at LSU, where a student literally died from excessive alcohol relating to hazing. I think that those kinds of activities should appropriately be handled by the legal authorities, but I think not only the kids should be punished in terms of being thrown out of school or simply put on some sort of disciplinary probation, but I think that they should go to jail. I mean, this is killing. Murder is murder. And by the way, I feel the same thing about campus sexual assault issues. I think as a rule, the sexual assault issues should be handled by the courts. If there's a rape that goes on by involving 2 individuals who are not involved with universities, non-students, and the person being raped wants to file charges against the other individual, that goes to court. It's handled by the prosecutors, the police, and the judiciary. And I think by and large that should be the way we handle campus sexual assault cases as well. And I will tell you, I was very strongly applauded Secretary DeVos in her recent actions to sort of try to right the balance in terms of fair play and due process in matters of this, matters like this. I'm probably getting getting a little far afield. Shelley Oberlander asked me multiple questions. They're all interesting, but one I just happen to be reading right now. Please address affirmative action. Has its necessary time ceased? Well, I think so. We're in a nation where I think most people, the overwhelming majority of people of goodwill, believe that people should be allowed to advance in life regardless of group characteristics such as the color of their skin or their religion or their other attributes, their gender, other attributes about them. And I think that this has been a revolution in American thinking over the last half century. 50 years ago, we didn't have that revolution. Maybe at that time affirmative action served a useful function. I think you could argue that point, make that point. Today, I think it is a very dubious point. I think that if we removed all affirmative action rules at universities, I don't think that we would see massive increases in overt discrimination in favor of one race versus the other. I think we would probably have a reduction in some racial tensions on campus. Ultimately, there's a lot of resentment on some people's part because of what they view as the unfair use of affirmative action. And I have become convinced that the affirmative action program is not working as it should, and who knows? I think this is In fact, here's a radical idea. I think universities should be prohibited on student admission forms, student applications, for asking the race of an individual. I think that is racist in nature to ask them, what is your race? And I am fundamentally opposed to it. And I was asked by Emma a sort of similar kind of question with regards to Title IX. Title IX has many dimensions to it. I do think, we should have open opportunities for people, regardless of their gender, on campus. I generally feel that there's too much government regulation in it. I think we're in a time of goodwill. After all, a lot of this was directed towards assuring a greater opportunities for women on campus. My gosh, 57, 58% of the kids going to college today are women. Indeed, you can make a pretty decent case that if there's a group that's being sort of browbeaten and discriminated on campus, it's white males. For every 3 males that are on campus right now, there are 4 females. And so, again, I wonder whether Title IX is necessary anymore, or whether or at least we ought to rethink some of the dimensions of it. Generally speaking, I wonder why the federal government should be intruding on local campuses. One of the great strengths of American education is every university is their own boss, by and large. That's not entirely true. There are state university systems that impose rules on their schools, but we have 50 different states, so we have at least 50 different ways of doing things university-wise. And since we got literally over thousands of private schools, and we also have state schools with a fair amount of autonomy, I think that provides strength. Students have more choice. They can go to schools that are very traditional, very, faith-based in nature, or they can go to schools with quite a different tradition. They can go to school where students are allowed to drink and do all sorts of activities and no doubt smoke pot and everything else, whereas we have other universities and colleges which have very strict rules against that. I think this is great. Vive la différence, the French would say. And yet when the federal government imposes more and more rules and regulations, be it Title IX, be it student financial aid, be it whatever, be it sexual assault, I think we are taken away from that. And so I do have some problems with that. Daniel wants to know why student graduates are being underemployed and working in Starbucks. Well, here's the basic math, Daniel. Every year we graduate 1.5 to 2 million new college graduates. Every year the American labor force is adding about 2 million new workers, but some of those new workers are people that are doing things that are tasks that are performed by relatively unskilled labor, or people who don't need a lot of skill. The workers in Starbucks and in retail trade, and some people on construction jobs, and even some people, let's say, the lower level of skills in the health profession, home health care aides and so forth. We need a lot of those. We're probably adding, in terms of managerial, professional, and technical workers, maybe 400,000 or 500,000 of these jobs a year, maybe a little bit more in some years. But we're turning out 1.5 million, 2 million new college graduates. The math is such is that there's not enough sort of high-paying, professional, high-skilled jobs available for the number of kids going to college. So that's why I say, and some people think it's provocative and they think it's terrible for me to say, but I think the evidence supports it. And in one sense, we're over-invested in college. We're having too many kids go to 4 years to get major in whatever, gender studies or social work or whatever it might be, economics, philosophy, and all. Some of these people are able to get jobs, but some of them are not able. They get some sort of job, but they're getting jobs that are not the traditional level. I jokingly have said that by 2025 you'll need a master's degree in janitorial science to get a job sweeping floors if things continue the way they are now. That's, of course, a bit of an exaggeration, but that's the way things are moving. And so maybe we ought to be telling more and more kids, why don't you go to welding school and learn how to weld? Or why don't you go learn how to drive a 18-wheel truck? Or whatever, learn how to fix hair. And these jobs pay a little bit less, but you also have a lot lesser expense. Remember, a good hunk of the students who go to college never graduate. They end up with large debts and relatively little educational skills that make them prepared for the labor force. So we have a lot of failures in higher ed. And so I think we should try to, I don't want to make higher ed elitist, but I think we need to perhaps dial back a little bit what we're trying to achieve and accept the notion that not 4 years of college is not the solution for everyone. So that is a question. Do you think? I've asked, do you think colleges should try to cut down on food waste? Well, yes. On that broad subject, here's an interesting little factoid. I think we're the price of college food, that is food in dormitories, has risen dramatically more than the price of food in the general public, whether it be food bought in restaurants, food bought in grocery stores, and so on. So there's a lot of money going into raising food prices as kids go to universities where they go to a monopoly dormitory where they're forced to live and they have to pay whatever the fee is. I think there's a lot of waste there, and that probably means a lot of food waste as well. One thing I would do is I would separate the food function from the education function. I don't think universities are particularly good in the business. Now, Maddie is telling me that we're at the end of the session, and I maybe have time for one more question. I'm asked, would you give the power to pass significant reforms in higher ed back to Congress and thus in the hands of the people to be beneficial rather than the Department of Education or executive agency having that power? I do worry too much about excessive executive power. The administrative state is getting out of hand in the United States, and while I'm not entirely confident in Congress's ability to perform well, at least that is a democratic process. So we are now nearly at the time where I think we have agreed that that I'm going to step out of this conversation and leave you. I will say this, I have enjoyed it very much.
All right, guys, thank you so much for participating tonight. I think that we all have learned a lot. Now, for the future, we are going to be posting this recording either on YouTube, or we're going to be allowing you guys to see this with a Google Drive link. So we will let you know which of those it ends up being. Now, as far as further information goes, I'm going to go ahead and switch to our survey page. Alrighty, so you guys can go ahead and answer this survey, but also make sure that you notice the links on the bottom of the page with more debate resources, Think the Vote, and then the website of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity. You guys can use that if you want to have further information on the topic. Also, to announce the winners of the free book, I've got Liam Reeves, I have Anna Eckert, Davis Chandler, Tiffany Hindstone, and Lily Young. Alrighty, so all of those 5 students or teachers that I have named, you guys can go ahead and email me at mhoward@billofrightsinstitute.org. That was mhoward@billofrightsinstitute.org. I've also opened up all of these polls so you guys can go ahead and answer those questions. Like I've said, you can email those 5 winners. Make sure you email me. But also, if you have any questions for me or any questions about further webinars or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than willing to talk to you guys about this. And I hope that you enjoyed tonight. And we'll see you for the next debate webinar.